Hi, welcome to today's webinar. It's part of the KaiNexus Continuous Improvement webinar series. I'm Mark Graven, a senior advisor with KaiNexus. I'll be your host and moderator today. And I am thrilled to have our presenter, Scott Gauvin. I'll more formally introduce Scott in a minute, but today's topic is an important one. It prompted a lot of discussion in advance on LinkedIn on this topic of respect for people. So the title today is Breaking Through Cultural Friction, the Role of Respect for People, Strengthening Culture for Sustainable Performance. If this is your first time attending one of our webinars, I want to welcome you. KaiNexus, real quickly, is an enterprise platform designed to drive continuous improvement and transformation across organizations. So to learn more about KaiNexus and how we help our customers, please visit our website at www.kainexus.com. And so now let me more formally introduce our presenter today, Scott Gauvin. He is the CEO of Macresco Consulting and the co-founder of the Respect for People Roadmap. With 30 years of experience in operations, Scott has helped organizations around the world and across different industries rethink the path to transformation, not just in their processes, but in mindsets. He's a contributing author to Leading with Compassion, Cultivating Connection from the Inside Out. And Scott believes real change happens when organizations bridge the gap between culture and strategy. Right now, he's focused on helping organizations unlock performance by systematically cultivating the behaviors that make it possible. And that's why today's such a interesting and exciting topic. Scott, I'm going to turn things over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Mark, and thanks for having me here.
Yeah.
It's a pleasure. And I'll start maybe by giving a little story about how I kind of got here. It was a windy path, but about 30 years ago, I started engaging with Lean, and the person that was teaching me, did a lot of the usual stuff. We 5S and value stream mapping. So I learned all of the tools, and I thought I understood it because I was doing it. I was working in a large facility, and we were having lots of success with it. It wasn't until a major transformation that took me to several different countries. I was working in France, Germany, Mexico, China, and several facilities across the US. It wasn't until I started working in some of those other countries that I realized that things weren't quite going as well as I had thought. It's not that culture hadn't kind of affected my previous work, but because the behaviors I encountered in the US were so familiar, I kind of missed the impact and the nuance that of the culture that I understood so well and was able to navigate through. But working globally kind of forced me to pay a little bit closer attention to, what built trust, what motivated people, even what offended people. And so it was this kind of close-up view of culture that made me think about and maybe approach the way I was doing Lean in a little bit different way than I had up until that point. At one point, I remember I was in China, and I was just having a lot of trouble moving forward, and I realized I was actually not aligned to some of their cultural norms, and it wasn't until someone pulled me aside and said, "Hey, here's all the things that you're doing wrong that just don't go in this culture." And it wasn't until I kind of thought about that, because at that point I thought, well, I have a good business case, and we've got to make these changes, and but the way that you make change very much depends on the cultural conditions that you're working in. And so, I started to see patterns, these kind of universal behaviors that either demonstrated or didn't demonstrate respect, that started to propel my performance across different cultures. And so some of what I'm going to share with you today is some of those hard lessons that I learned, and hopefully it doesn't take all of you as long as it took me to learn some of these lessons. So hopefully I can shortcut that learning a little bit. So what I wanted to share with you today was kind of what I've learned about culture and how it makes or breaks Lean success, the workplace dynamics that that really affect the outcomes. How to operationalize respect for people. It was something I really struggled with, and I've spent a lot of time on, especially over the last 5 or 6 years. So I want to share with you how I've operationalized that, and then really maybe at the end I'm going to share a case study to show you really the impact that it can have when you roll it out systematically and at scale. And again, I hope that it doesn't take you as long to learn, that culture is only half of lean, and that but it carries most of the weight. What I'd like to do is invite people in their chat to share why does lean fail? We hear stories, and there's been lots of articles written about why does lean fail. What are some of the reasons that it either fails, maybe comes up short, or it doesn't achieve the outcomes that you were expecting? So I want to start there.
And I'll help read some of these off. I'll give an answer since I have the microphone. I think if lean sometimes fails when a leader says we're going to do this because it's somehow trendy or popular and they're not real committed to it, and then there are bumps in the road and they stop.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah,
so people are putting in the chat, no buy-in from executive leadership or middle leadership, doesn't always respect the people. It's considered optional to stick to the new ways of working, not linked to the goals of the company. When it's a top-down initiative, failure to change people's mindsets on change and growth and learning, because it's a journey, not a destination. And many think that it's a single goal, but it's an ongoing process that doesn't stop. I've seen this one too much. Lean is viewed as a cost savings initiative.
yeah,
Lots of steps in an A3, and people don't want to spend the time to do a thorough project, so they slap on a Band-Aid. Got a few repeats here. Looked at as tools, not a change in mindset is a new one. It's not owned by everyone, just owned by a CI group.
yeah.
And adopting tools without understanding the principles and systems or the problems to be solved. It's a long
Yeah,
list.
yeah, it's a long list, and it's a good list that represents
Mhm.
people's experiences, right? I mean, we've all had different experiences where it didn't work, and hopefully we've had experiences where it did work. I'm going to come back to some of those responses in a minute, but I believe really the answer to why lean doesn't meet all of the expectations that we have for it is really rooted in how we think about and approach it, and that's a lot of what I'm going to kind of focus on. So to just transition here, I'm going to talk about how culture makes or breaks lean success, and for a lot of organizations, at least a lot of the client organizations that I work with, Mark, lean is driven by the elimination of something, some kind of waste in the pursuit of efficiency. And I know the MEP network has a definition of lean. I think it's something like a systematic approach to identifying and eliminating waste through continuous improvement by flowing the product at the pull of the customer in the pursuit of perfection. And it's a great definition, but it's a definition of continuous improvement, not necessarily of lean. It's in my opinion that definition is missing the respect for people piece. And part of it is that the way I think about it is that the continuous improvement piece is the piece that's very tangible. It's the piece that it's kind of the go-to. A lot of tools. There's a structure. There's a model. There's processes to follow. Um, but I think of lean as a system. And so when I look at the Toyota way and the system that they have built, there's two parts to that system. There's continuous improvement and there's respect for people. And that's the part of the system that is powered by the people. And Toyota very clearly points out that culture is half the equation. Unfortunately, it took me 15 years to stop focusing on just CI like it was the whole game. And so that's kind of what I want to focus on today is the respect for people piece. Um, Along with kind of that global transformation that I did, that experience, I came across this quote at one point, and it was almost kind of a turning point for me because it just wasn't, it hit me in that moment. It was a good moment, and I started to really think about, oh, Well, first we build people, then we build cars. It's a quote often cited by Fujio Cho. Um, and I remember when I saw that, I said, well, yeah, of course, first we build people. And then the next thought I had was, well, what am I doing first? Am I fixing process first, or am I building people first? And it kind of it was like this flood of ahas that came to me. And at the time, my understanding of driving performance, even my understanding of Toyota success, was entirely different. It was so much around the processes that they had put in place. Um, and so that kind of led me to thinking about, why lean transformations fail. And we hear lots of different percentages. And what I want to go back to people is what percentage of lean transformations fail, in your opinion? What is that number? We've heard lots of numbers in different media. And some of them have been debunked, as you and I spoke about, Mark. But I'm curious for others, if they want to throw it in the chat, what do you think that number is? What is the
Yeah.
percentage of lean transformations that fail? Oh, 90, 60. Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, we talked about this in a podcast yet to be released of like, what do we mean by fail? I mean, but
Hmm.
I see 90, 42, very specific number, 80%, 80%. See, 42 makes it sound like it's really backed by evidence.
Yeah. And you're right. What does fail mean? Does it mean that it didn't complete the way we expected? Did we not get the results we were hoping for? Did it just crash and burn? There's probably a spectrum, and the numbers here are kind of representing a little bit of that spectrum. But whatever it is, it's it's greater than we would like it to be. That's kind of the point here, is that lean tends to not give us what we're hoping for as often as we would like, and that's kind of what I want to poke at a little bit. And so a lot of the reasons that you shared, and that you had listed at the very beginning, are similar to the things that I've got on this list. Lack of leadership, resistance to change, an overemphasis on the tools, not enough engagement from everyone in the system, a failure to align not only the strategy and the purpose, but even the people. And then maybe there's no plan to sustain it. And so those are a lot of the reasons that I've seen. And so I want to transition over to a little bit of a fundamental understanding of what needs to be in place in order to improve that rate of success. And it's really thinking about the workplace dynamics and how the workplace dynamics really shape, what that success could look like. And so if we know this already, then respect for people, we know that it's important. But why isn't it more widely practiced? Well, I've got a few theories. I think one is that there's really no clear breakdown of how to operationalize it. We try to solve it with kind of one-off trainings or maybe some arbitrary skill building. And not that those skills aren't useful, but they're often not integrated as part of kind of a learning system. Sometimes we confuse individual acts of respect with organizational practice of respect for people, and think that because we're not jerks, or that we're already being kind or nice or polite, that we have got it. In fact, I think in the clip that you shared, that's where I kind of broke down what I think the difference between respecting people versus respect for people is. And if I just share that again, it's respecting people is kind of the individual action I take. It's based on my personal value system. It's based on how I engage with you. But the way I engage with you can vary from day to day. So there's a variable element to it. Whereas I think of respect for people as something that is how we are designing respect into the systems, the policies, the processes, into the culture of the organization. It's not something that is individual. It's something that's universal. It's a practice that universally we are engaged in. It's not something that's just for leaders. I think I shared with you, Mark, that when I reviewed a lot of the literature, a lot of the literature talks about what leaders should do for people in order to practice respect for people, and that gives it almost a hierarchical approach, and it's not hierarchical. It's universal across everyone. It doesn't matter what role or position or title you have. It's a universal practice for everyone. And it's something that needs to be more proactive. It's not something that is just reactive in that moment. It is the things that you're thinking about and doing proactively so that you can make sure that there's a consistency for everybody in the organization and within that environment. Um, it also feels a little fuzzy. And then, that we sometimes will say, okay, well, that's a people thing. That's HR's job. That's lean for HR, and don't see, how our role um, really comes to shaping what the practice of respect for people is. So those are some of the reasons why I think that maybe we don't embrace it as often as we should. Um, I love this quote by Edward Deming. Every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets, and so we're getting what we've designed. We usually apply that thinking to our production systems or our value streams, but it also applies just as powerfully to our culture. Culture is really everyone's job. It's not just the leader's job, because it's really in the context in which we make decisions, perceive and solve problems, determine what and who is valued, and then when and how people actually can use the CI tools they're taught, when they can apply them. So culture is a system too. It's like any system. It produces those predictable outcomes, often without us even sometimes realizing it, maybe even for better or worse. So, so I want to give you an example, and you can throw these in the chat again, so you can get ready with your chat. Um, what's the first word that comes to mind when you see this picture? So I'm going to share a picture with you. I can tell you, don't try to analyze it. Don't try to think about it. Don't Just give me your visceral response. That's what we're looking for. Just that visceral response. So what's the first word that kind of comes to mind when you see that picture? Um, you don't think about it.
What?
Just kind of throw it in there. Risk. Yeah. Okay.
Oops.
Fail. Lazy. Yeah. Storm. Hazard. Lazy. Yeah. Lots of lazies. Lazies.
Why?
Yeah. Yeah. And those are a lot of the typical ones. I can tell you the number one answer that we get is lazy, doesn't care, government work. Those usually tend to be some of the top ones that we get. But I want to share with you kind of the story about this. So imagine now if I told you that prior to this incident, John, the guy that painted that line, um, was considered a high performer, and that morning his boss gave him an ultimatum and said, "Hey, hit your mileage quota, or you're probably going to be looking for a new job." Corporate's come down on me and said, we need to hit our mileage quotas, and you've been coming up a little short. Um, and John says, well, but don't I do a good job? He said, you do a great job. You're very conscientious. Your lines are always straight. But we got to hit this mileage quota. And John's like, okay, well, but the crew's not cleaning up the road like they're supposed to. I got to stop the rig. And so he's, no excuses. I need you to hit your mileage quota. Well, with that context, you might see this white line a little differently now. But it's John's story, and how John's story demonstrates, to understand why this happened and fix it. It's not enough to just look at how the line was painted, or how the worker was trained, or how he should be disciplined. You have to really look at the whole cultural conditions, the environment, the situation that led to its painting, and really what behaviors impacted how that work got done. And so with that context, we started thinking about this, and the way that employees, or what we see is that the way employees interact and how work gets done reflects those cultural norms at play, the system that's been put in place, either intentionally or unintentionally, and what reinforces them. And so there's this feedback loop between individual behavior and the organizational culture. And so, if you go back to social learning theory, it suggests that people learn behaviors and values and those norms by observing others. And so in the workplace, employees take their cues from leaders and peers, gradually adopting those behaviors they see modeled, which then shapes the culture in that process. The other thing that we noticed and that we learned is that there's a bidirectional feedback loop here, and so an input from an individual into that bidirectional feedback loop will affect the culture, which then that culture then affects another individual. And so if you've got a negative feedback loop, if you've got these negative behaviors that are feeding into that feedback loop, then you're going to be working towards creating a negative culture. But the antidote, interestingly, is to feed positive behaviors back into that feedback loop. And if you feed those positive behaviors back into that feedback loop, it also can create a culture. So it's about, what are you noticing? What are you correcting? Are you correcting those negative inputs? And are you systematically putting in positive inputs into that feedback loop? And that became a very critical component to understanding why there are sometimes negative cultures versus why there are sometimes really positive cultures. And, if you've done any kind of touring around of companies, there are some that are great cultures and there are some that are like, whoa, would never want to work here cultures. And what we're seeing is that the ones that are negative have a lot of negative inputs, and the ones that are positive have a lot of positive inputs. Doesn't mean the ones that are positive don't have some negative inputs, but they're overwhelmingly more positive, and that's the key. So with that, that kind of led us to, okay, well, how do we then operationalize respect for people? Well, that took me back to a lot of research that I started to do. And so when I was starting to face my own resistance in the work that I was doing, there was misalignment, there was low engagement. I started to wonder if the problem wasn't the tools themselves, but really the environment that they were being used in. And so my efforts to kind of decode what respect for people is led me to thinking about the Toyota environment and what Toyota employees did especially well. And there were three things that I started to notice, or there were three insights that I had. And it wasn't just Toyota, but it was other companies that I thought had, if, when I went there, I couldn't quite describe it, but it felt like they had a positive respect for people kind of environment. But the three things were, so the first thing that I noticed is that people saw behaviors more objectively. The second was that they really valued the entirety of a person's experience. And the third was that they connected people to a collective wisdom for this mutual benefit. And I realized that these were the cultural conditions that I saw that were missing or lacking in a lot of the organizations that not only struggle to make continuous improvement stick, but that were also struggling with performance or sustainability, or they just had a lot of these negative inputs into that feedback loop. And so what I was noticing in some of the organizations that I was working with is that they were not objective but reactive. They would often jump to action without really enough context or understanding, or that they valued technical skills and maybe people's status versus kind of the overall experience, and that they often turn to the usual suspects for answers instead of really actively seeking diverse perspectives. And I can give you a couple examples. So, valuing the whole person, I remember asking, they were sharing a story about this woman, Maria. And I said, well, I don't understand. Why did you invite Maria onto this team? And they said, well, Maria, you're right. She doesn't know anything about this product. She doesn't know anything about this process. She hasn't even ever been to this department. But we know that she has traveled to a lot of different countries, especially a lot of countries where our customers are. And so we wanted to invite her in because we just knew that she would see things different than we would see them. So, okay, that's interesting. I said, well, what about Mike? Oh, yeah. Well, Mike, he's raised five boys. So can you imagine how he sees things differently than us? And I marveled at just their ability, one, that they knew these things about the people, but that they had enough insight to say, hey, those people are going to think differently. And so let's invite them into this conversation because they may challenge us in a way that's beneficial mutually for everybody, not only just the company and the customer, but for us as well. And so I took those three things and I said, well, how great would it be um, if I could teach my client organizations to do those things? And what would that look like? And so I started to try to figure out how I could operationalize what those three observations were that I made. And so reverse engineering partly what clients were doing, and then paired with kind of these hallmarks of the Toyota culture, that really kind of helped me identify the conditions that organizations needed to create if they wanted to improve employee satisfaction, engagement, performance, quality. And so for me, improving how the organization functions as a whole starts with really thinking about and improving how coworkers think, relate to one another, and see each other as individuals. And so when those kind of everyday interactions start to shift, the culture really begins to shift. And that's what created kind of the lasting change for different organizations that I was working with. And so that insight led me to define kind of three core cultural conditions that I thought were necessary. And so I took seeing behaviors more objectively, and I called that one engaging. Let me back up. I called that one engaging with compassion. And then I took valuing the entirety of a person's experience, and I called that treating people like they matter. And then I took connecting to collective wisdom, and I called that partnering for mutual benefit. That then led me to kind of this framework that starts with how individuals perceive and respond to the most constant aspects of work. People in the technical problems. And so we know that every organization wants their people to better see and solve problems, but we know that solving the right problems kind of in the right ways requires big picture thinking, not just jumping to conclusions or reacting from a habit. And so I started to ask, what are the behaviors that support this objective thinking? Now, what does it take to shift the way someone maybe frames a problem? And that led me to three core behaviors that I thought if I could teach my client organizations those three core behaviors, that could lead us to this engaging or what we called engaging with compassion. And it was if they could check their perspective. So it was really, could they slow down and examine their assumptions? Are they seeing the full picture or are they just seeing a slice of it? So the second was seeking to understand. So could they stay curious? Could they ask questions? Could they listen better for the context and try to see the situation from the other person's perspective? And then could they move to act as support? So instead of fixing for the sake of just fixing a problem, could they act in ways that really truly helped the other person move forward and solve their problem? Um, and so together, these behaviors added up to engaging with compassion as kind of they remind us to look beyond really the surface appearance or those things that seem like obvious behaviors, like a lazy curve around a branch, to consider really the context of people's actions. And so the goal that we had for engaging with compassion is really to move from reactive to reflective problem solving. And it's really by learning to recognize and diffuse judgment, that skews our decision making, that maybe strains team dynamics, but that can also derail us from really seeing what the real problem, the real root of the problem is. And so that's engaging with compassion. The next one led us to, so after we kind of address how people frame problems, we turn to our attention to how people perceive their coworkers. And so, it's easy to assume that maybe competence is tied to someone's status or their title or their role. But when we do that, we start to overlook the value of people's lived experience, their interpersonal strengths, their non-technical abilities, especially from those in less visible positions. So this way of thinking not only discounts people's contributions and limits their collaboration, it kind of diminishes their potential. And so thinking about how to help people more fully see and value the people they work with led us to kind of the next three behaviors. And the next one was prioritizing well-being. It's really about recognizing that people do their best work when their physical, their emotional, their psychological, their financial needs are supported. The next one was then moving into valuing individuality, and this was really about the the beginnings of appreciating the unique mix of strengths, experiences, and viewpoints that each person has. One of the things that we noticed is that people say, well, that feels a little personal. And I don't share my personal life at work. And that's really, and what we're realizing is that's really a mistake because knowing that Maria traveled to so many countries or that Mike raised five boys was really what gave them the impetus to say, hey, these people have value outside of just their discrete role. They actually have lived experiences that might be valuable to this conversation as well. And then the third one was spotlighting others. And it's really about appreciating and showing gratitude for who people are, not just what they do. It's about recognizing kind of the personal qualities, the contributions, and the everyday actions that make a difference, especially the ones that might often go noticed. I get a lot of pushback on the spotlighting others just because it says spotlighting others. So we have this idea that, in front of a group of 100 people, I've got to call that person out. That's not what spotlighting others is. Spotlighting others is noticing, putting a spotlight on, hey, that person just made a contribution and recognizing them. But it doesn't have to be in front of everyone. It could be, you could do a handwritten note that you just slip to them. It could be taking them off to the side and saying, hey, really appreciate how you stepped up there and what you did. And recognizing them for not only their contribution, but for who they are as a person as well. So it can be done in quiet ways, or it can be done, in more robust ways in front of people. But it is about spotlighting the contribution that someone makes, and who that person is, and connecting their contribution and appreciating who they are, and connecting those two things. Um, and so these kind of affirming behaviors translated into what we call treating people like they matter. They really enable us to more clearly see and call on maybe the talents or the expertise or the experience in our coworkers. The goal of treating people like they matter is really to move from the isolation of indifference, and maybe the stress of feeling like you have to solve everything on your own, to more inclusive interactions where we reach out and connect with the people around us and the expertise that is around us. And so this principle is about kind of recalibrating our perception of who and what is valuable, and who is qualified to solve problems, so that people can feel more comfortable and prepared to step up and effectively collaborate and contribute. And then that kind of moved us on to the next one, um, which is really thinking about how at work we're really always working towards collaboration. And so the way we communicate, what we share, and how open we are to new perspectives not only impacts our individual efforts, but it really influences our collective success. The way we support teammates, the way we engage with our teammates, the way we communicate with our teammates, and whether or not we ever really get to those new ideas, that innovation. We're always talking about, getting to innovation or being innovative, but it really requires a high level of collaboration to be able to do that. And so thinking about the skills to be able to collaborate with people beyond kind of the usual suspects, or the usual things that we might collaborate on, led us to three key behaviors that we thought were important. So the first one we call showing your cards, and this is really just about being open about your intentions, your challenges, your goals, and the idea here is to really begin to build more on trust and transparency. You're building on trust all throughout these other behaviors, but this is really kind of where it starts to, the mortar really starts to set in between the bricks. And then the second one was speaking with candor, and this is about communicating directly and but considerately, even when it's uncomfortable, so that people can take real action. I always chuckle a little bit because people are like, well, is this speaking with candor? And what they're describing is how rude they were when they just threw something out there. It's not just saying what's on your mind. It's a balance between saying what needs to be said when it needs to be said, but with care for the other person. And there's a real balance that you have to strike there, because sometimes it's not the right moment to say it. Sometimes you're not even the right person to say it. And so it's about evaluating, what needs to be said, what does that person need to hear, and why do they need to hear it? Do they need to hear it so that I can zing them, or do they need to hear it because it's actually going to make it better for them? It's going to help them grow, and it's going to help us collectively grow. And that's really the focus of candor. And then the last one was getting on the same page. It was really about prioritizing dialogue over debate, to create kind of shared understanding, and alignment and commitment. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't an appropriate time for debate, but what we noticed is that if you start with debate, you often get people in positions and then they start to argue about their positions. Whereas if you can almost kind of control yourself to say, hey, we're just going to have the conversation, without taking a position. We're gonna have a dialogue so that we can get it all out on the table. And then if we're running out of time, then we can move into debate. What we noticed when we did the research is that our brains have a hard time going from debate to dialogue, but we can go from dialogue to debate much easier. So starting with dialogue is really important if you want to get people on the same page. And we call that partnering for mutual benefit. So together, these behaviors add up to, again, what we call partnering for mutual benefit. And partnering is how really teams work their way up to innovation that I was saying earlier. The goal of partnering for mutual benefit is to move from conflict to collaboration. And so we do this by moving from kind of the transactional like tit for tat interactions to partner more of a partner mindset that sees collaboration as an opportunity to create for everyone's benefit versus competing for resources or recognition. But there should be a mutual benefit that's coming out of this. And so that was the model that we came up with. And so in order to operationalize all that, we started thinking about, well, if we could get people on our team or we could get people in an organization to really embrace and practice those 9 behaviors, well, now I got a foundation for how I can operationalize what the practice of respect for people looks like. Um, and what I wanted to share with you is, thinking about how organizations can scale kind of these principles and behaviors of respect for people is kind of what led us to create what we call the Respect for People roadmap. And so our goal was simple. It was to provide an actionable, scalable solution to support lean transformations, most common pitfall, which is the culture piece. And so, we've been implementing this now for a couple of years. And what we've consistently seen is that when organizations embrace this, they're seeing very positive results. And I have a quick case study that I'm going to share with you here just to kind of give you an example. Um, and so this client is a sheet metal fabricator, was really struggling with what they thought were productivity issues. The real challenge was how people were actually working together. They were facing a lot of the problems that are, common problems. They were a technically strong organization where, but collaboration hadn't really evolved at the same pace as kind of their technical capabilities. And so they had a lot of silos. There were a lot of departmental barriers that made it hard to solve problems across functions. A lot of problems got passed between departments. A lot of issues got kind of kicked down the line instead of being resolved kind of at the source. HR was fielding a lot of interpersonal conflict. And there was a lot of firefighting, and it was just diverting the leaders from really focusing on growing the business. And they tried to introduce lean a couple of times, but it, I don't know, quote unquote, failed or didn't quite work or didn't stick, however you want to think about it. But it didn't have the intended effect that they were hoping it would have. So they kind of realized that no amount of optimization would take if people weren't working together. So we started to look at it as like the culture was really the bottleneck that they were trying to overcome. So they decided to start their relaunch of their lean journey with the half of lean that they had never really considered before. So instead of throwing more process at the problem or more tools at the problem, they did what most manufacturers don't, and that's what is that they went all in on culture first. And so they put the entire company through learning the practices of respect for people. And so they 100% of the employees went through learning about those and actively working to practice them. In a few months into rolling out the program, workplace dynamics were already beginning to shift. So we're only a few months in. More employees were starting to think about the upstream and downstream implications of their work. So they're thinking about the next person, really, not just what they were focused on. Issues were no longer viewed as in kind of isolation, but as part of kind of the larger system. So more people were thinking more systematically. The COO said that people told him they were communicating better with their spouses their families and their neighbors. So it was having an effect not just at work, but even in their personal lives. And that he was seeing change in people that you normally only attribute to major life events like deaths and weddings and things like that. Something that he really wasn't expecting, and he said even especially from his workforce. So only 8 months into the launch, they are now 12 months since they launched. But this case study was done when they were 8 months in. And the last cohort is just finishing up now. The organization has achieved a 23% increase in output, not from the CI tools or software or automation, or adding more people or equipment, but from just better collaboration, more proactive problem solving, improved communication. There's a lot less conflict. Employees are starting to lead daily stand-ups, almost impromptu because they're like, okay, how do we get on the same page? So they're like, well, we need to chat in the mornings, and so organically, some of these things are coming up. And so teams are becoming more aligned in resolving issues before they escalate. So they're starting to resolve them kind of on their own. Efficiency has significantly improved as the problems are increasingly solved, of course, at the source. And they're starting to begin this kind of culture of continuous improvement, and it's kind of emerging almost organically. And so with that, I think we'll take a moment here and open up for questions, Mark.
Yes. Thank you, Scott. Fascinating topic, and thank you for presenting today. I'll encourage people, please go ahead and continue submitting questions using the Q&A button, and we'll do just a few quick announcements first. Our next webinar is still TBD. We normally do one webinar a month, but if you would like to check out our webinars on demand library, you can do that at kinexus.com/webinars. You can also go to our KaiNexus YouTube channel, and we encourage you to subscribe and check out. There's 100 plus, 120 plus webinars from about 10 years available there. So lots of great content to check out. Also invite you to check out our blog.kinexus.com. Lots of great articles and insights about continuous improvement, and encourage you to go check that out. If you like listening to things, check out the KaiNexus podcast. You can find it through Apple Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, Overcast, basically every podcast app or service, or you can go to kinexus.com/podcast. If you want to, revisit Scott's session today, the audio from today's podcast will be available. The audio from today's webinar will be in the podcast feed. And then finally, your feedback matters. I know sometimes we get surveyed to death, but we do read all of the feedback about the session. We would love to get your input about what kinds of topics you would like to see in here future webinars address. So when you leave the webinar, please click on that continue link to go to the survey that is meaningful to all of us here. And during the Q&A session, you'll see websites for Macresco Consulting at macresco.com, Respect for People roadmap.com. You can learn more about what's got introduced to us today. So let's see.
And Mark, I just dropped in the chat. If anyone wants to try and kind of experiment with the content a little bit, there's a demo that they can go and do for free, and they just log in, and it actually takes them through it a little bit.
Okay, yeah, thank you for sharing that. And those who are just listening, it's respectforpeopleroadmap.com/demo. All right. There's a question from Pedro, and I'm going to combine it with a question I was going to ask about assessing the level of respect for people, either as an individual or as an organization. And Pedro asked a related question. Would it make sense to consider assessing observable behaviors so we can understand where to improve and align these behaviors?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things that has started to emerge from doing this is, we've got 9 behaviors that really have come out of the practice. And what I'm starting to see from organizations is now that people know what those 9 things are, they're actually holding each other accountable to those behaviors. So, if someone isn't appreciating maybe the way they should, they'll say, hey, I think there's a spotlight that's deserved here. Or one of the tools that we have is in checking your perspective. We call it the tabs tool, and it's just that it's a way to evaluate whether you're making an assumption or judging. And I hear in meetings once in a while, like, hey, I think we need to check our tabs on this. And it's just a moment for that group to say, hey, let's pause. Are we making some assumptions or are we making some judgments here? And so that feels better to me than this external assessment that I can do because it's really owning the culture. Everyone is owning the culture and everyone is owning the accountability uh,
Mm,
to and for each other. And that was kind of how we were hoping to design it, was that we wouldn't have these external things. Now, with that, yes, we've considered putting together different kinds of audits and assessments and to measure. We haven't put anything together yet. And ironically, I just wrote an article about you can't audit your way to operational excellence.
mm,
And part of that is because I get this question a lot. Yes, it is helpful to kind of know. But what we have found is that if you understand these 9 behaviors and you are working to improve them, it kind of almost organically manages itself.
mm.
So,
Yeah. Well, and I think that that collaborative approach might help guard against people overestimating
mhm.
their own following of those behaviors, and hopefully in an environment where people feel safe to raise the issue. I imagine leaders have to actively invite that to say, "Hey, call me out if I'm falling short."
Yeah. Yeah, and that's actually part of the pro. So we have a one of the activities that we ask people to engage in is going to 3 different people and asking them the question, what is it that I could do or stop doing that would make working with me
Mhm.
easier? And interestingly, that's a really hard exercise for a lot of participants because it forces you to be vulnerable. But it's getting that direct feedback around what would you like me to stop doing or start doing to make your life easier, not to make my
Mhm.
life easier, but to make your life easier. And when people get that direct feedback, we always hear, I was a little surprised. I'm glad that I got it because now I know.
Sure.
But they find that that's a pretty tough exercise to do. And it feels like a simple question, but there's a whole pile of skills that you need in order to get there to do that.
Sure. Okay, thanks. There's a question from Jennifer, and I can imagine somebody asking this. She's asking a question on behalf or a question about a question. How would you answer an executive who asks, well, how long should it take our organization to complete the roadmap?
Yeah, so well, it part of it is how it's rolled out. So what we usually recommend is it's about the total content is about 40 hours of work. We recommend doing that over about a 15-week period. So you're investing about 2-ish hours a week, roughly. And that gets you through the whole program. However, at the end of the program, we invite you to take on another 90 days, and that is where we invite you to develop a better plan. And the better plan is really taking one of the 9 behaviors and making an action plan, kind of a micro habits plan on how you're going to get better. So it's 15 weeks plus another 12 weeks,
Mhm.
but it's very much an individual journey, and so that kind of gives you the timeline. It's 15 weeks to kind of go through the formal part,
Yeah.
and then that 90-day cycle we've seen teams now repeating that 90-day cycle, and they're like, okay, we've gotten through that first behavior. Now I'm going to pick another one, and they do another 90 days. So
Mm.
it could go on for a while, depending on how you want to continue to develop yourself.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for that question, Jennifer, and thank you, Scott, for addressing that. Um, let's see. I think that was a similar question about the timeline, and I think you've addressed that. But there's another part of the question here that Sarah asked. who needs to champion this for the respect for people roadmap process to be successful?
Yeah, so ideally, the senior leaders in the organization, those who have influence, are the ones who would champion it. But it can be we've done it in organizations where it's a very large organization, and so you've got a department that said, hey, we are the engineering group, and I'm the director of engineering, so I'm gonna do it with my people, and we did it with just his group, and tremendous benefit. You don't see the organizational benefit unless you can go beyond that group. And so, the higher up you can get someone in the organization to sponsor it, the
Hmm.
better, because then you can kind of cut across. But you can even just do it with your team. If you're like, hey, all I can influence is just my team, you could do this with just your team, and you will absolutely see the benefits. You see the multiplier benefits when you have multiple teams doing it. But there's benefit in just having a team doing it. So it can really be done at any level of the organization.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Scott. Um, One question I wanted to ask or hear more of your thoughts on when you talk about executive involvement. Early on, when you asked about some of the reasons lean fails, we kind of heard two sides of things. We heard one person say it was too much of a top-down initiative. A couple people, including myself, said, well, there was no executive support. Where do you find the balance between executive involvement, but not being something that's just strictly dictated in a top-down way?
Yeah, I mean, you need someone who is at least saying, "Hey, this is really important, and I don't want to hear we're not going to do it." And so you need enough of an influence that is going to say, "Hey, we need to do something," but you also don't want to micromanage it because no one likes to be micromanaged.
Right.
But if you if you've got a leader who's like, well, cross my fingers, hope it works, and then they're out,
Yeah.
that's just not going to work either. So there is some balance of, hey, this is, and I think it's more about connecting it to the goals and the purpose of the organization
Mm.
than it is about the pushing it into, as a force. Because I've been in organizations where, um, they made it an important thing to do, but they didn't force it, and it took a while for kind of the momentum to get going. But then once it get going, there was a steeper curve after that. But if they had pushed too hard at the beginning, I think people would have gotten turned off by it. So there was a
Mm.
they kept reiterating that it's important, that it's critical, that we should do this, and kind of kept the message going. But they didn't bring the hammer down, and I think that was an important thing because it allowed people that transition to kind of accept, okay, yes, I got that this is important, and how can I engage in this? Because sometimes that
Yeah.
that pathway is a little longer than leaders would like, but it's
Mm.
still
Yeah.
nonetheless an important pathway that you've got to allow people to go on that journey. And so I think it's unique to each organization. Um, what I have never seen work is where a leader is just like checked out. Like, well,
Sure.
that's operations is doing that, so good luck.
Right.
And they're completely removed. I very often they might get very quick improvements, but then it trails off. And that's when we say, oh, it didn't stick. Well, it didn't stick because it didn't have support often.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think in general, large scale change, whether it's lean or culture change, it doesn't work when an executive gives, a one-time talk to an all hands
Mhm.
meeting. It takes cultivation. It takes ongoing effort.
Yeah. And if I go back to that image that I showed you where it was individual and culture, and there's that bi-directional feedback loop, that is where the leaders are critically important. If they are constantly dropping in positive messaging into that bi-directional feedback loop,
Hmm.
it might take a while for that to kind of come around, but it does come around. And so it's more about, again, that consistency, I think, like you were alluding to. It's that consistency of messaging that if they do that If it's a one time, well, it dropped it in and then it fizzled out, right? And then that bidirectional feedback just went away. But if it's a constant feedback that people are getting, then it starts to resonate. And for some, it resonates. It takes longer for it to resonate than it for others,
Sure.
but it eventually comes around.
Okay, thanks. We've got two more questions that came in, and I think we can address them before the top of the hour. There's one question: what are the possible signs in an organization that shows that the cultural issues are the main challenge, the thing that we need to work on so we can initiate corrective actions that keep the cultural issue on the forefront?
So the
What are the signs that our culture really needs to be improved?
Yeah, I mean, if you're, I mean, there's a lot, but if you're feeling like, you're isolated, if you don't feel like you can raise an issue, if you feel like you're always trying to solve the problem on your own, and it's too risky to ask for help from even from peers, or especially from peers, if if leaders are microly focused on performance and not thinking about kind of the impact that that's going to have on people, these are all things that when I go into an organization, I'm looking around. I can tell you, my favorite thing to do is when I tour an organization. When I'm walking around, if people are not looking at me or engaging in conversation with
Mm,
me, that tells me a whole lot right there without anyone ever saying anything.
yeah.
Because people are like, oh, the boss is here, eyes down. That tells you a whole lot about kind of the environment that they're in. And they're not in an environment where change can even be considered. It's do what you're told to do. And so there's lots of those signs. But if you don't feel like you're supported, if you don't feel like people are listening, if you feel like there's a lot of assumptions being made, if your well-being, you don't feel like well-being is being considered,
Mm,
if you don't feel like people know who you are and the contributions that you can make more broadly than just the task that you're doing, if you don't feel like you're being appreciated,
mm,
if you don't feel like you can be honest about what your challenges are or the help that you might need, if you don't feel like you can say the honest truth about what problems are, and if you don't feel like you're in alignment with people, those are all the things that that we've identified as those are problematic. Those are problems that the culture is manifesting. So
okay, thanks, Scott. And last question that came in. Um, what's the best way to implement in a union environment? I don't know if that's referring to implementing the Respect for People roadmap. Have you had experience with people trying this in a union
yeah,
shop?
and what really surprised me is we had a couple of organizations that came to us that were union shops, and the union loved this program.
Hmm,
Because a lot of the issues that were being raised and a lot of the grievances that were coming up were very directly addressed as we were kind of going through this program. What I often find is that, in union shops, I mean, the union is there really to say, hey, listen, we're trying to create an extra voice for the employees. And if they feel like they don't have a voice, well, then of course that's the need for the union is to make sure that they have a voice. And the whole program is around how do we make sure that people feel seen, heard, and valued.
hmm,
And so it very much supports what unions are looking for and want to be seen, heard, and valued. And that's kind of what the whole program is really about. So we
yeah,
haven't yet, and it's only been a couple of organizations. We haven't had any issues with union. In fact, the unions, once we sit down and share with them what this is, they really embrace it. It's been, in fact, I might even go as far as saying it's more accepted in a union shop than sometimes in other places,
hmm,
because the union will often message it in a way that say, "Hey, this isn't for our benefit," and I don't always get that in some other places.
hmm. Okay, well, great. Well, thank you everybody for showing up today. Thank you for participating in the chat and in the Q&A. And to wrap up, again, want to thank our presenter, Scott Gauvin, CEO of Macresco Consulting, co-founder of the Respect for People roadmap. So you can go to macresco.com, respect for people roadmap.com. I'll make sure those links are in the YouTube video description and the podcast show notes. So Scott, thank you so much for giving us, I think, some really practical tips to operationalize really important lean concept. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Mark. And it's a pleasure being here.